Hello, and welcome to this NJCU Center for the Arts digital event. We would like to ask everyone to please keep your cameras and microphones off during the program. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the program, and we will only be accepting questions and comments via the chat window. At the bottom of your screen if you are on a computer, or possibly the top right if you are on a different device, you should be able to see an option for chat. If you click that, it will open the chat window where you can type your questions so that they may be read aloud and answered. Thank you, and enjoy the event. Please note, the views and opinions expressed in this virtual event and presentation are solely those of the individual artists in their personal capacity and are not reflective of nor represent official policy, position, or views of New Jersey City University.
My name is Stephanie Chaikin. I'm the director of the Center for the Arts at NJCU, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon for an amazing presentation about Thank God I'm Home, the First Meal series by Julie Green. We're going to have a discussion with former New York Times national correspondent Kirk Johnson and Professor Sara Sommervold, who's the deputy director of the Center for Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University. And we're led by Dr. Midori Yoshimoto, our galleries director at NJCU. So Midori, I'm going to hand this over to you to start us off.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us in a virtual space. But I am physically in Lemmerman Gallery, Harold B. Lemmerman Gallery in Hepburn Hall. It's a 100-year-old Gothic cathedral-like building in New Jersey City University, located in Jersey City, New Jersey, in case some of you are joining us today from Oregon, where Julie Green was based. I originally met Julie when I was visiting Oregon State University in Covadis as a visiting scholar. And she showed her work back then in 2008 and kept in touch since. Back then she was making a series of work called Last Supper, for which she's best known. She depicted a series of last meals of people on a death row on a ceramic plate in blue glaze. And she kept painting that every year for almost 2 decades. Until this fall, she unfortunately ended her life prematurely at age 60, and when she painted the 1000th plate. So we are very honored and feel special to hold this exhibition, solo exhibition of First Meal by Julie Green here at the NJCU on the other side of the East Coast. And I'd like to maybe show you how this exhibition shows about 13 works in this very cathedral-like high-seating space. The exhibition is up until March 25th, and we are open tomorrow, especially for Jersey City, Fridays, 11 to 5. So please do come and visit us. You can email me at myoshimoto@njcu.edu. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today, special speakers, Kirk Johnson. His 38-year career at New York Times took him to nearly every state in the nation, in covering economics, public safety, the environment, and politics. He was born and raised in Utah and now lives in Seattle with his wife, Flan. And after Kirk's presentation, we also hear a shorter presentation from Sara Sommervold. She is Deputy Director of Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Leveraging Her career-long specialties in indigent defense and reform. Sara is focused on sustaining the center's role as one of the leading organizations of its type in the country. She has published scholarly articles addressing the unique issues surrounding the wrongful convictions of women and speaks about wrongful convictions and women and clemency process around the country. So I'm really grateful for both Sara and Kirk for agreeing to join, share your experience with working with Julie and also your own point of view on these exonerees who were depicted in this first meal series. Thank you. So I'll now hand over to Kirk.
Well, thank you so much, Dory, and thanks everyone for attending. First words out of my mouth should only be that I'm not the one who should be talking to you today. It should be Julie, of course. She was an inspiration to me on so many levels. I knew her for about a decade after meeting her and writing about the Last Supper series, and we then connected again to work together on this first meal project, which will be published in a book by Oregon State University Press. Say just a little bit about how I'm organizing what I'm going to say. Some of what I talk about in these different paintings will be from what Julie wrote about the art and its inspiration and construction, and some from the reporting that I did about the case or interviews with the exonerees or attorneys or court documents involved with it. Some will be a little more of one and some more of the other, but maybe we could start with the first one then. This is Champagne for Christine Bunch, and it was the first one that Julie did. And she talked a lot about how it was a learning experience in what the form would be, which she wasn't sure of. She wrote that it was the use of Tyvek material was partly what she came up with in this first project as a backdrop for the painting. But in talking about Christine's case, she wrote, the beautiful red cardinal Illinois state bird was used as a signifier of place, but also of scope. Like wrongful convictions, cardinals spread across America. 7 states have chosen this as a symbol, she wrote. In my interview with Christine Bunch, what really struck me as a theme of all this and runs through many of these cases was the sort of arrogancy of certainty that put her in prison for 17 years for a murder she didn't commit, the death of her own son in a fire. A witness for the prosecution, scientific witness, said accelerant had been found in the little boy's room, and on that basis, Christine was convicted. Many years later, it was revealed there was no accelerant, and he had gone beyond the scope of the evidence he had before him. Many of the stories and the paintings are really haunted by stories like this. Go to the next one. Johnny Savory, subject of this painting, spent 30 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Julie was inspired by the meal he had after his release of steak, and I was inspired in talking to Savory by the stories he told me about his father and the joy and the love affair that he had come to have with food and cooking through his life, and growing up as by a father who had raised him as a single father. He said to me that he could still see decades later how his father would stand at the stove making gravy. And Savory said that through his years in prison, he held many of these images in his head as a kind of anchor of belief that could keep him going through the decades of wrongful conviction. Julie wrote in describing the painting, "This composition came to mind fully formed. As soon as I read Johnny Savory's food story, I pictured a spode porcelain Weber grill. Most paintings are worked and reworked, but not this one. Sometimes a painting paints itself," she wrote. Next. Jason Strong spent 15 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And the story that haunted both me and Julie in this image, or in this story, was of his first meal at a little cafe upon release, where at the end of the meal, the waitress overheard Strong talking with his attorneys about what he had missed most in prison. And the thing he talked about was oranges, that there were certain kind of fruits that you could get in prison, but never oranges. And so the waitress disappeared into the kitchen and brought him an orange. And he was so moved by it, he couldn't, just holding it, he couldn't get past that for a long time. And it really haunted Julie too in thinking about that. She really struggled with the idea. She said, "I know how to paint an orange. I don't know how to paint not having an orange." And she struggled with that problem as an artistic issue of how do you paint loss? How do you paint not having a thing? She said she paced, she left town. She went and spent 10 days in Idaho, walking and thinking about absence and distance and how you did it. And she said she focused on the clouds, and she came back and still wasn't sure she had found what the essence of absence and how you put that into art. But Strong's story was also incredibly powerful. He emerged as a really advocate for other wrongfully convicted people, and has done many video interviews and advocacy podcasts trying to help other exonerees in their journey, either before or after exoneration and release. Next. Randy Steidl spent 16 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And in Julie's thinking about his story and in creating this painting, she said that she was led in hearing about him to think about different forms of art as both sort of high and craft art, and what the difference is. And she wanted to explore that in a bit. She wrote that in this country, most historical ceramics and textiles are functional or decorative. And in college, I was told ceramics were not considered high art, but just craft. And that was enough, she said, to encourage her to examine it more deeply as a free-thinking, contrarian artist. If someone said it was craft and not high art, she would find a way to make it high art, I think. Real art can be hidden in plain sight, she wrote. Here, a spode platter holds the meat. It was this thought that Julie explored in my conversations with her and talking about this painting, about the line of the precious and the mundane, as she described it, of where that line is between the high, sophisticated sense of what a thing is and the inner importance that it may be under the surface. in telling Steidel's story, I focused what I wrote about the little restaurant that he ate in southern Indiana, about short drive from the prison after his release. And it was, I think, in trying to keep with Julie's sense of the precious and the mundane, really telling the story of one sort of Midwest restaurant where he ended up by chance because it was close, and it had a deep family story that really resonated with his own Midwest story, where he had been born and where the crime he was convicted of also occurred. Next. Fernando Bermudez spent 18 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And Julie was inspired by Bermudez's story of, after his release, heading home toward a reunion and a first meal with his family in Washington Heights section of Manhattan, where he'd grown up. But in talking to him, he also talked about a first meal that was, in some ways, he said, even more meaningful and important to him when he was still in prison, still seeking his exoneration. Several months before it had all come down and all settled and his release came, he was in his prison cell, he said, and a guard who he had made friends with over the years walked by, having just picked up his meal from KFC. And he just out of the blue dropped a chicken breast in Bermudez's little input thing into his cell where he would deposit meals, and just nodded and walked on. And he told me he was so moved by that little act of kindness in a place that where kindness had not occurred, that it became in some ways his first meal of many. And he said he retreated into the cell and ate it, and it represented, he said, a feeling of gratitude that goodness could come in a place where there was very little of it. Julie, I think in this image, really captured the urban space that shaped Bermudez and the man he became. She said that in describing it, that she wanted to think about the place in Upper Manhattan that had shaped Bermudez to the man he became. But in finding material for the painting, she wanted to pull out all the stops, as she put it. I opened my grandmother's big blue glass canning jar full of buttons, some a century old, with the price still marked, 12 blue glass buttons, 20 cents. And she decided to use those for the painting as a signifier of meaning for herself and something that she thought would connect with his story as well. Next. Julie said she spent a month working on this composition, much of it swimming in the Oregon State University Dixon swimming pool. The bottom of the pool is blue. And she saw that over and over as she thought about how to capture Marcel Brown's story. And she said it really went into the creation of it, the thinking through swimming those laps. Marcel Brown was spent 7 years of a 35-year prison sentence for a murder that he did not commit. And he was arrested as a teenager and interrogated for something like 30 hours, during which he was denied access to a lawyer that his mother had sent. And it was partly on the basis of that denial that the confession that was coerced out of him was eventually thrown out, that led to his release. But what really, I think, captivated me in reading about the case was how much during that 30-hour interrogation he kept asking about home and his mother. He asked something like 23 times if he could call home or contact his mother, and was told no each time. And it was also those words upon his release that Julie seized on too, that thank God I'm home. The idea of home, I think, was what Julie was aiming to capture, and what really resonated with me in reading about Marcel's story. Next. Leslie Vass spent 10 years in prison for an armed robbery he didn't commit. And it was his images, and talking about, he grew up in Baltimore, eating a lot of seafood, and that's what he would want, he knew, on his release when he went home to have a meal with his mother. In talking to Vass, I was really struck by the idea, by what he talked about of how do you reintegrate into the world after a loss of those years. He had been a star high school basketball player in South Baltimore, and he was a 6'7" forward center, being courted by big name colleges, thinking of a career in the pros, when it all crashed and he ended up in prison. And he said he came out and went to the old places where he'd grown up, and they were gone or changed. And he has struggled in the years since to, I think, as he put it, find his footing again. He said that one of the things that struck me in my conversation, repeated conversations with Leslie, was he had gone through a time of being homeless. He'd gotten stranded in his car in the middle of nowhere. He was living, when I spoke to him, in a basement apartment with a low ceiling. He's 6'7". He said, every time I stand up, I have to duck my head. But it's not the most important thing in life. I'll find a way through. He said trout were somehow an inspiration to him, and had been his whole life in prison, because they only move forward. They don't look back, and they only swim forward. And that's what he said he has to do, and how he has kept going. Next. Valentino Dixon spent 27 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. During that time, he really emerged within prison and came to national attention as an artist as well. He had always been interested in drawing and in art, and in prison it became, I think, a kind of savior to him. He spent 6 to 10 hours drawing every day, especially after his perfect behavior in prison led him to be allowed to work pretty much unmolested. And it was the warden had seen his work and asked as a favor if Dixon would draw an image of a golf section of the Augusta National Course that the warden was either fond of or vexed by or something. And he brought a picture of it to Dixon, and Dixon studied it and drew it, and it eventually came to the attention of Golf Digest magazine. And Golf Digest magazine, unlikely source perhaps, started digging into Dixon's case. And it was through that, as well as some work by students at George Washington University, that Dixon was finally exonerated. He has continued to do art, and to this day, much of it involving golf courses. Julie, in writing about Dixon, said that she wanted to capture a kind of sense of wildness that can happen in art. And she said that's why the lobster, she said, needed to fly over the scene of a golf course. Dixon ate at a Red Lobster restaurant on his release. She wrote, "Art achieves this magic. To capture that feeling in its wildness, it demands the wildness to be not about anything, but simply to be." And that's an assertion of freedom, just as Dixon's choice of a lobster dinner is an assertion of freedom, however and whenever that occurs. Next. Patrick Prince spent 26 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And he ate shrimp and grits at a trendy restaurant in Chicago upon his release. And Julie was captivated by the idea of the shrimp and the idea of really returning to also a place not far from where the murder had occurred that destroyed his life when he was accused of it. I tried to, in what I contributed to it as well, to talk about the sense of place that exonerees return to. Some do go back to where they were from, like Leslie Vass in Baltimore and many others, but to return for a first meal to a place, within walking distance of the nightmare that really came to you as an assertion of strength, that struck me, and a sort of ownership of reasserting one's sense of a citizen of the world. Julie, in her portion of the contribution in the book, wrote that peering out from behind a cliff is a plastic goat head logo cut from a bag in our closet that held a new cashmere sweater. I look around to use what's on hand, improvise and recycle. Shrimp are creepy looking but tasty. I plan to make a few decorative shrimp with the appearance of reverse applique, but the composition wanted more and more and more. His plate, she wrote, should be brimming with shrimp. Next. Michael Evans spent 27 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, was ultimately cleared by DNA evidence that said he could not have committed the crime. He said in the interview form about his first meal that he entered the restaurant and was struck. Many of us take it for granted now, but he walked in being sort of stunned by seeing cell phones everywhere and people looking at their cell phones, and he had not ever seen anything like that. And it captured Julie's imagination. And so she said she wanted, so she wrote, I painted a huge iPhone with a steak on the home screen, a steak made of silk and palladium. I use icons for phone, email, and the Chicago Cubs. Evan's first meal was shared with loved ones at his sister's home. They enjoyed T-bone steak and potatoes on what Michael Evans called a glorious day. I was struck in talking to Evans about his faith journey. He had said that during prison, his faith had just deepened and deepened into something that got him through those years. And he said, he told me, prison is a negative place, and to stay encouraged or positive, you have to encourage yourself, he said. So it became a practice to read a passage from the Bible on a daily basis. I would always read a scripture, and I would meditate on it day and night, and it would encourage me to move on to another day. I held on to that. It was the only thing that kept me alive and believing. I couldn't see light at the end of the tunnel, but I believed somehow, some way, that God would find a way and make a way. And he carried that with him as a sense of life. He said finally to me that his sense that human beings, however much they can make errors and create terrible acts that harm people, that the acts of humanity were also ultimately reduced by the forces of God that he saw. Man was not able to create the skies, the sun, the moon, and make it light and day, and put it in harmony with the rain and snow and changes of the season, he said. There's more out there than just us. Next. Huey Burton spent 18 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And what really struck me about his story was the music that he studied and really worked on as a therapy and as a means of connecting with his father while in prison. Julie wrote that in his interview form, she had this perfect handwriting that she admired from the beginning, and he wrote, "Truth freed me, music kept me sane while I waited." And she wanted to include that in the painting. During his father had been a professional musician, and Huey had also studied music or thought about music as a young man before his wrongful conviction. But during his years in prison, his father started giving him music theory lessons over the telephone, which struck me as just incredible, amazing thing in a chaotic, crazy, dangerous prison to listen to your father talk about, major 13th chords and how you construct them, and hear the intervals you think about, and are you doing your hand strengthening lessons for your keyboard, and how's it going, and go back and work on that chord progression again. And he said it brought them together closer in a way they never had been in the outside world. And he said it helped his father too, that since Huey Burton was horribly convicted of murdering his own mother. So his father had lost both his wife and his son to the wrongful conviction. And he saw these music theory lessons, ultimately, he said, as a way to help his father, who had to deal with both those two losses. And his father sadly died before Burton's release from prison. So he never got to actually celebrate that in person with him. Next. Julie Ray spent almost a decade in prison for murder of a wrongful conviction of murder of her own son. And the image here shows what she talked about on the gathering after her release, where a friend stepped up and hand-fed her blueberries. The blueberries had meaning beyond just something sweet and delicious. Julie had food health issues growing up, and she'd solved them before her wrongful conviction through dietary means of a lot of antioxidants and ciders and whole foods, and she'd gotten her health in shape before the conviction. But in prison, she said it all unraveled because of the terrible food that was served there. And one of the things that really struck me in talking to her, Julie Bray, was the way that punishment and food were so still intertwined in the American justice system. She said that the women in her prison would be kept at their dining table for extended periods when the food was especially bad, and the guards would insist that they sit there and smell it or look at it, or if they couldn't eat it. And then at times when some fruit would be served, they would be punished if they tried to leave the cafeteria, leave the dining hall with it. She said to me, girls would grab that fresh fruit and stick it in their clothes to try and steal it on the way out so they could take it back and eat it on the unit. And so right outside, the guards would shake us down, and you'd see all those oranges and all those apples thrown to the ground, and they would just go to waste. That's the kind of insanity surrounding food that you see in a prison. It was a sense to her of the petty vindictiveness that can happen around food that I think also captivated Julie Green. I'll just wrap up with the end of Julie Ray's story. She had told the police that her son, her little boy Joel, was murdered by a stranger who broke into the house and stabbed him. And the police were skeptical, didn't believe it. That it's just so unlikely. That doesn't happen, they said. And the jury believed it, and she was convicted. And years later, a type of serial killer admitted that that's exactly what happened. It was in that town, didn't know the house, broke in, killed a little boy, struggled with a woman who tried to defend him, and ran off. And everything that Julie had said in defending herself was true. I'll hand off to Sara at that point, but thank you again for attending.
Well, thank you so much, Kirk. And I thank you to Professor Midori. Thank you to the New Jersey City College. I'm really honored to be here. And as Kirk started, none of this would be happening without Julie. Julie should really be the one to tell these stories in this way with this medium. And it's all of our loss that we don't get to have the opportunity to hear her talk about this extraordinary work. As has been said, my name is Sara Sommervold, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Center on Wrongful Convictions. I am going to speak briefly about some definitions and just wrongful convictions generally, the kinds of things that we find in every case that Kirk has talked about and in every case of wrongful conviction that we ever deal with. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some of the cases that are represented in some of the paintings. There will be a little overlap with some things that Kirk said, but as you will see, incarceration is about deprivation. It is about absence. It is about all of those themes that Kirk was discussing and that Julie was trying to capture. And we are at the intersection of that incarceration being wrongful and the moment that the deprivation is taken away, and how the extremity of both of those poles. I was struck by several phrases. The line between the precious and mundane, that is incarceration. that's wrongful conviction. Everything is mundane, and it is also deeply precious because it's been taken from you. So you can move to the next slide, please. I'm going to start by just giving some definitions. What is an exoneration? I'm using this definition that's from the National Registry of Exonerations, which is a website that any of you can peruse just by Googling National Registry of Exonerations. There are detailed accounts of nearly 3,000 cases of wrongful conviction and incarceration on the website. The registry defines exoneration as an official act declaring a defendant not guilty of a crime for which he or she had previously been convicted. And the sources of those things are pardons, which is an executive branch power, convictions vacated after new evidence is revealed in litigation is when that happens, acquittals after retrials, also litigation, and posthumous acknowledgement of actual innocence. I just want to make a note that the CWC and many organizations that are doing this kind of work are moving away from exoneration, from that requirement, and starting to use language around freed people. The path to exoneration for many individuals, in particular women in this country, is incredibly onerous. It is unreasonable, and as you will see from the facts and details that I will share about these cases, the uphill climb to prove the negative, to reveal official misconduct, can be a barrier for getting anyone any relief at all. So we are opening ourselves up to resentencing and clemency to just get these individuals relief. We can fight about their innocence and their exoneration status when they have their freedom. Next, please. So these are just a few stats that I also pulled from the registry, just to give people a sense of these enormous numbers. And Julie had the opportunity to capture a handful of these cases, really, when nearly 3,000 exonerations have happened in the United States since 1989, and that just simply does not represent in any real sense the number of people that have been wrongfully convicted and are currently wrongfully incarcerated in this country. I always include the women's stats because they are stark and disturbing in my opinion. Less than 9% of the exonerations to date have been women in the United States. That's troubling for a number of reasons. First and foremost, women of color have been the largest growing incarcerated population in this country for the last 20 years. And when I say largest, I mean by hundreds of percents, close to 700% 5 years ago. So we are clearly missing a lot of people who are currently suffering severe deprivation. Next, please. So these are the most common issues that we find represented in wrongful conviction cases: bad eyewitness IDs, perjury and false accusation, official misconduct, false or misleading forensic evidence, and false confessions. In all of the cases that Kirk discussed, in all of the cases that I will discuss, typically a combination of one of these issues is happening. Over 50% of cases involve official misconduct. And when I say official misconduct, I'm not implying there's malice. I'm saying people make mistakes, things go wrong. Sometimes there's malice, sometimes there is intentional wrongdoing, and oftentimes there is just an enormous system that rolls over people. Everyone is overwhelmed, everyone is overworked, everyone's caseload is too much, and we stop paying attention. We stop caring about the actual individual human, and everyone starts to become numbers and people that we are moving around with paper. Nearly 60% of all wrongful convictions also include perjury or false accusation. Perjury is, in fact, lying. False accusation doesn't necessarily mean that the person is lying as much as they are wrong. I just want to point those things out. So then I'm going to start with next, please. Daniel Taylor, whose painting you saw previously. Daniel's case involved both official misconduct and coerced false confession. 2 weeks after a double homicide in 1992, 17-year-old Daniel was arrested for the murders. And Daniel was convicted based entirely on a coerced false confession, despite the fact that at the time of the crime, he was in the lockup in a local area police station. And all of the documentation that surrounds people being incarcerated said as much. He was in prison for 22 years based on that coerced confession before he was released. And it was revealed that all of the gate sheets, which if you ever visit a prison, every time they open a door, every person that walks through the door's name is written down. And then they close the door and you move to the next door and they write everyone's name down. So every time he moved around that space, someone recorded his presence in the space. All of those gate sheets were available in 1992 when he was 17 years old. And they were held from his attorneys. They were discovered, in fact, by the Center on Wrongful Convictions when we went through a discovery process in his post-conviction with his post-conviction petition. It took 22 years for a 17-year-old boy to be allowed to be believed. And in 17 years, he never got to choose anything. He never got to see color. He was in a state of total deprivation. And I would say that Kirk pointed out arrogance is a running theme here. And arrogance is what put many of these people in prison, and it definitely put Daniel Taylor in prison. He was questioned to the point of being convinced that there was no hope in the truth, and there was only hope in telling the questioners what they wanted to hear. And he did that, and it got him sent to prison for 22 years. I love that painting. I love how it reveals Chicago and color and light. Many of the men that actually all three of the men that I will discuss today were in Illinois prisons at a time where food in the Illinois prison was, in fact, very, very harmful for the men in particular that were incarcerated here. I'll move to the next painting, which ties well with Juan Rivera's story. Juan, Daniel, and another one of the paintings I'll discuss were all incarcerated in Illinois during a time when the Illinois prisons used a soy-based diet for everyone across the board. And soy is very, very high in estrogen. And they were eating soy 3 times a day. And over about a decade, which all three of the men here would have been incarcerated during that time, everyone was sick. Everyone was sick all the time. Digestive illnesses, all kinds of chronic indigestion, and you're in prison. You're in a toilet that's in the middle of the room. Everything around food and how you related to food was corrupted and ugly because of their incarceration. So in Juan's case, I love this. He became a vegan while in prison, and he ate his first meal at a vegan restaurant in Chicago. Juan's case also involved official misconduct and false confession. In 1992, Juan was convicted of a rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl named Holly Staker. At the time, Juan was on probation and on electronic home monitoring. But the police just refused to believe that he didn't tamper with his monitor and leave his home to commit the crime. Speaking of arrogance, there's nothing that a 19-year-old can do but tell you that he's been home on electronic home monitoring. And if you don't believe it, he has no recourse. He has no way to show you that nothing has been tampered with and he was in fact exactly where he said he was all along. Juan was so shaken and distraught by the questioning that they ultimately restrained him and confined him to a padded cell at the jail where he was being held. And he beat his head against the wall and pulled bloody patches of hair from his head until a state's attorney came into the cell with an already written confession for him to sign. And in that state, all of the law enforcement agreed that it would be appropriate to ask him to sign that confession in that cell, which is what he did, and then proceeded to spend more than 20 years in prison fighting that conviction. He was tried 3 different times, and all of it, every single time, was based on a confession he gave from a padded cell. I will say that Juan ultimately won the largest settlement against the county that incarcerated him in the history of Illinois, and it will never be enough. It will never be enough. Next. Kirk spoke beautifully about Christine's case, and I bring it up here for several reasons. Christine's case also involved false official misconduct and misleading forensic evidence. Women do not tend to be convicted of crimes that involve strangers, especially violent crimes. So the gold standard in the innocence movement and proving innocence sort of everywhere is DNA evidence. Just get the DNA evidence and we'll set them all free. No woman has ever been exonerated based on DNA evidence, largely because if you know the people who you are charged in crimes against, your DNA is going to be present and not in any relevant way. So forensic evidence, especially that gold standard DNA evidence, is not available typically for women. And often women are involved in cases that involve a high level of forensic evidence, whether it be medical. In this case, it was arson. Those cases are very complicated. They are very expensive. And women just don't have the access to representation in the wrongful conviction space because of that. Christine was convicted after a house fire in 1995 and found guilty of murder by arson in the death of her 3-year-old son, Anthony. Chrissy called him Tony. And in 2012, Christine's conviction was reversed by the appellate court after evidence was presented to that court about the evolving forensic science around arson. Arson, until the last maybe 15, 20 years, was an art, considered an art and not a science, which unfortunately it wasn't very artistic and quite a bit too subjective for anyone to be basing someone's life on the stories that were being told around alligator patterns or V patterns, which have now been determined by the ATF to not mean really much of anything. You can detect accelerant. You can't detect how or why something burned by the patterns that you see on the walls or in the floor. Ultimately, as Kirk said, accelerant was blamed for the fire, and they claimed that that Christine had intentionally framed her child's room in accelerant. And all of that was untrue. And in fact, her child had died from carbon monoxide poisoning before the fire ever started. all of which was proved in front of the appellate court. Christine was told when she was being sentenced by the judge in her case that he believed that she had become pregnant on purpose while her trial was happening in the hopes of getting leniency. And that he was going to be sure that Christine never raised the child she was pregnant with. And Christine didn't. That child was 17 years old when she was released, and she gave birth to that child while handcuffed to a bed. And those things all happened because people misrepresented and lied about the evidence in her case. And she was incarcerated from 5 days. She was arrested 5 days after her son's funeral. And that is an uphill fight. The CWC took Christine's case. We managed to include an extraordinary group of pro bono advocates that fought for her case. It is a case that is representative of the kinds of things that happen to women in wrongful conviction. And it is a case that's representative of the really tremendous hurdle that women face in fighting these kinds of convictions. I especially love her food story because she was released and asked for color and seafood, and they were in a restaurant that served no seafood, and the chef heard Christine's story and made scallops and grits for her and put together an entire platter of fresh vegetables after hearing that she just walked from the courthouse to the restaurant and hadn't had a fresh vegetable in 17 years. Next. So I will end with Marcel Brown, who Kirk was discussing previously, and Midori was standing in front of this glorious work when we started. Marcel was just 18 years old. It was the September right after he graduated high school, a little near and dear to my heart as my kids go to the high school that Marcel Brown graduated from. And he was in a local park. It was nice outside. There were lots of people in the park. He was with a cousin. There was shooting. And they all ran. Everyone ran. And he and the cousin, who was younger than he was, 15 years old at the time, were arrested for the shooting. A body was found the next morning after all of all of the shooting and the running from the park happened. And Marcel was held for 34 hours, asking over and over for his mother to go home. And his mother was there. His mother was at the police station. His mother had hired an attorney, paid the retainer, for which she has all of the receipts. And the officers denied Marcel access to the attorney. And after they denied him access to his attorney, he made statements that were used against him as the basis for his conviction. Marcel was really fortunate, that his mother actually paid and had records of paying that retainer, but also in the state of Illinois, the Illinois Constitution requires that law enforcement give suspects access to retained attorneys upon request. And for the fact that they turned his attorney away and then got inculpatory statements from Marcel was the basis of the reversal of his conviction. He was, in fact, given 35 years, not for shooting anyone. They claimed that Marcel drove his cousin to the park and that his cousin actually did the shooting. And he was sentenced to 35 years for being the driver at 18 years old. His cousin has also since been released from prison and is no longer convicted of this crime.
So far, okay, here we go. We have one from Alec. Was there a particular work that spoke to any of you?
I'll go. I think it was, for me, as I said earlier, the Leslie Vass story of the trout. Something about how Julie
Is this
captured
location work?
I think so.
Were you able to see me?
something about that image and the power that she put into that fish. Just really, to me, said a lot.
I love that one too. I also really love Juan Rivera's painting. To me, it speaks on so many levels. The restaurant that they went to was called Blind Faith, and she's incorporated that sort of theme and the blind justice and the prayer and the hopefulness of that moment and the sort of sadness of it all at once. I just think is quite extraordinary.
For those of you unsure of where you can ask questions, you can do so via the chat. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says chat. You can go ahead and click that and type your questions there. We have a question from Elizabeth Houston. Do you know why Julie chose particular people to paint?
You want to go, Sara?
I don't know why she chose to paint in the order that she did, but I think that largely she painted what she got. We made a lot of requests and did a lot of these sort of one sheet interview forms, and then I would just send them to Julie as they were completed. And I don't have, maybe Kirk has insights as to how she chose to start one versus choosing to start another.
I don't know, except as she talked about starting with Christine Bunch and it going from there. And I think then whether it was a matter of the paintings or the stories she chose, but she also learned from other people along the way, Jason Strong especially, who connected her with other exonerees. And I think there was a sort of cumulative decision-making as she went that also, I think, shaped the artistic decisions that she made about how to present those stories.
All right, our next question is, let's see, we have the question, which painting is your favorite? I don't know if you consider that to be the same answer as earlier. If it isn't, go ahead and answer that.
May I address that from the
Yes,
gallery?
please do.
Hi, sorry, I had a microphone issue earlier. And Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. Elizabeth Houston was also the gallery that showed the same body of work right before us, and we split the cost in shipping. So I really thank her for cooperation for this exhibition. My favorite is this one. This one is Hooper, Fries, and then, and it has a great detail, gold cross. I think it's hand stitched. Gold cross is also hand stitched on flies, but the plate has Juan's name on it. It's almost like commemorating his name in a very decorative way, Victorian style. And the whole thing is made into very ornate, style that is very far from the subject matter of this wrongful conviction and exoneration. And that's why I think I'm drawn to this one. I don't know if either of you know story about this one in particular, maybe not this one.
I don't have
Sara?
I have no insight into Juan Melendez. I believe he is in New York Innocence Project
Okay,
client.
okay. So she combined the interviews from your center based in Chicago and then also some in New York.
Right. Well,
Is that
and
right?
we reached out to exonerees everywhere, not just our clients. There are multiple projects in the Midwest that we had access to several clients, just not that one.
Okay, great.
Yes, did do some outreach with New York as well as in the Chicago area.
I have also a question from my colleague Eileen here helping me today. Did some of the exonerees see her work and what were their reactions, if you know?
As far as I know, they all received a facsimile, I guess.
A print.
Print
Yeah.
of the piece. I don't know and wasn't privy to any feedback they had about it to Julie.
I know that, yes, she sent, whenever she completed a painting, she would send a print and I think even a gift card to the exoneree who was the subject. I know in the case of both Julie Ray and Christine, they were blown away by those paintings. I think that in fact, the Julie Ray's painting really sparked a whole friendship between Julie Green and Julie. They became quite close.
Mm. For me, that fact that she chose to represent their first meals instead of their faces or likes of their bodily appearance is something very specific to her work. And I don't know if either of you or both of you have something to say about her choice of the subject, the food, and how maybe these exonerees responded to that specific question about the food.
In my conversations with Julie, we talked a lot about sort of the nature of choice, and that's what really inspired both of us, I think, of how a moment like that comes to be when you're denied choice for some cases decades, making a choice that might be, again, back to the mundane and the sacred in a way. When you've been denied choice, that choice is a declaration, whatever it is. And that's what really inspired her and me as well, that there's such a powerful thing in suddenly having a choice of a simple thing that all of us think about every day without thinking about it at all, but is deeply meaningful when choice has been denied. And I think that led to a lot of her own choices in how to present it.
I think when the project started, we had actually co-sponsored an exhibit of the Last Supper, and her piece of the Last Supper, and we did, to open the exhibit, we did a Q&A with a death row exoneree by the name of Leroy Orange, and several exonerees attended and Christine in fact met Julie at that event. And that event is also about, it's also about choice, these final choices. And I do think that they met in at that intersection of, I'm an exoneree and I made a choice as well the first time I ate as opposed to the last time I ate. And I think that a lot of conversation started there for, I know for, even for the exonerees, and we do make a point of doing something when we walk out of prison with someone, going somewhere, letting them experience something that they have missed or want or crave. I know Daniel Taylor said he thought about milkshakes. He just thought about milkshakes in prison.
Mm. Well, in fact, many exonerees choices were fast food. So we have a lot of hamburgers and fries in our gallery. And so is pizza.
Yeah, I think they're also, that's still the only food that they ever see that's not the kind of gruel that they get in the cafeteria setting, that they see television, they see commercials, they see fast food more often than they see anything else while they're incarcerated.
I thought I will close up to this Mac Manhattan one, which doesn't show very well in digital image. It has so many gold leaves attached to it. So you really have to come and see in person. Are there many other questions? Maybe if there are similar questions, we can consolidate.
We have a question from Jalissa, and it's probably a question that you would have to answer with some kind of speculation, but is it convenience that a lot of people get incarcerated for crimes that they don't commit? Like, is that why? Or is it laziness on the part of the justice system to not look more into these cases? Why do we think that people are being wrongly incarcerated in the way that you have described?
I think, and this is just, as you pointed out, speculation. We have a highly criminalized system, and there's a considerable amount of imbalance in training and understanding of the in understanding the consequences and outcomes that that the system drives. I don't think it's convenient. It's nothing but inconvenient. All of it is inconvenient. Any contact with law enforcement is just a bureaucratic morass that you get involved in from that initial contact onward. It may be laziness. It's definitely tunnel vision. Laziness, I have no idea what drives the individual decision maker, but the tunnel vision, the priorities and the goals of the individual state actors are problematic. I would say that, and that those priorities and goals definitely contribute to a lopsided need to incarcerate. And that's driven by the state, it's driven by the media, it's driven sort of across the board culturally. If we are aware of harm, we demand retribution. We want consequences, we want punishment, and all of the system, once activated, works towards that. It doesn't work towards truth. That's not what anyone is demanding. And it's not working towards justice because we've decided that justice is conviction and punishment. So that's what that is my off the cuff answer for how we end up in this situation. It is not simple. It is very complicated.
And I would add from my own reporting on this, echoing Sara, that more often it seems to be a combination of shortage of resources, whether in time or in financial investigation abilities in small towns, a belief in the judgment of a detective who has a gut instinct, and following through when caseloads are crushing, and that adds up to people moving things along.
Great,
I
thank you
see
so much.
question from Keith, but unfortunately, Julie is not here to answer about the strategy to bring these works to life. I don't know if that's what you were asking about the procedure. I'm not completely familiar how she started and executed the work, unfortunately. But these are the more recent body of work in relation to the Last Supper that Sara mentioned earlier, which led to this current body of work. So if there is no other question, maybe I would like to wrap up, and also forgot to mention most important thing is that Kirk Johnson, one of our speaker today, has written this manuscript, and what he read today is only less than half of what he's written. And we are going to publish this as a book from Oregon State University Press, hopefully within a year, and for which we received a grant from Ford Family Foundation. So we are really grateful for that. And also the Julie's gallerist, Theo Downs Luguin, he really helped and catalyzed this exhibition. So I really thank you for doing everything you could to make Julie's work visible. So is it okay? Is there any more question? Then I will.
Thank you.
No, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much, Midori and Kirk and Sara. What an empowering, important presentation today and exhibition. I hope everyone comes in person to see this exhibition, and I hope it lights a fire under us to participate and help in this area. So on the screen, the exhibition is up through March 25th. There's special weekend hours this weekend, Saturday, 11 to 5. And then during the week, it's open too. Thank you, Eileen Ferrara, our Assistant Gallery Director, for all of your help in this. Thank you to Anna Carhart, our Theater Manager, Sabrina Saballo, our Box Office Manager and Zoom Coordinator, and John Osborne, our Audio Engineer. We have some amazing other programs that are coming that we would like you to come visit us for. Our MFA exhibition with Nedko Busev is March 14th through the 25th in our other building, the Visual Arts Gallery. There's an opening reception on March 14th and an artist talk on March 17th. You can register on our website, njcu.edu/arts. And then upcoming, we have the musical Pippin from our students and the Joffrey Ballet School, March 25th, 26th, 27th, and April 1, 2, 3 in our Margaret Williams Theater. So please come and see that. We have an amazing virtual program talking to the girls, an intimate and political essays on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. This is a book that's coming out by Dr. Edwidge Junta and Marianne Trosciati. So that conversation with the editors will be virtual on March 31st at 11:30. And finally, we have two amazing programs from literature books. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde on April 13th, and The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir, on May 18th. So those are virtual and free of charge. So visit us at njcu.edu/arts to register and come visit us often. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Sara and Kirk, for wonderful presentations. It really, both of your talks really deepened our understanding of the subject and how Julie worked. So I really thank you.